Ivan, could I ask you to just briefly introduce yourself and maybe some relevant industry experience?
Yeah, no problem, Paul. So my name is Ivan Diggings. Long background in procurement and supply chain. So I started in procurement, then moved into what I would call a kind of much wider supply chain role. So I did that for a few years, and then latterly into what I would call large head of function procurement roles, so CPO, Chief Procurement Officer type roles. In terms of industries, at a senior level, I've worked in oil and gas, so a company supplying pretty heavy manufactured equipment for oil and gas. A business in the security sector, so airport security, so a bit more high-tech manufacturing there, much more electronic based. And then latterly moved from PLC environment into public equity, working for a business that manufactured and rented modular construction, which was a completely different dynamic.
Definitely, yeah. And Ivan, thank you for that intro. I guess what's really interesting is that certainly from your experience as being a CPO, I'm hoping and expecting we're going to get some very interesting insights from that world, but also I guess your observations of watching the other functions, let's put it bluntly, battle it out sometimes across a whole range of different topics, but including inventory. So as we get starting into the kind of main topics, I just think it'd be really useful just from a starting point, at least from your perspective, just like defining what we actually mean by inventory optimization. And I guess critically, what is it, but also perhaps what it isn't and what some of the common misconceptions are about it.
So I think it's probably best, Paul, to start with what it isn't, because it's very interesting. I don't want to stray on to some of the later questions, but depending on where you sit in the organization, you have different opinions of inventory, what it's for, how much you should be holding, et cetera, and how you should measure your inventory. So what it isn't is the lowest level of inventory you can have. Clearly, that holy trinity, as we've talked to it in the past, of how much inventory you should have compared to what you're prepared to hold, compared to how you service your customers, is vitally important. And so I do think that sometimes companies can drive for the lowest level of inventory without thinking of the customer impact. That's one of the reasons, one of the biggest things for me in terms of what is not inventory optimization. But to me, if I summed it up, it's about good balance, balancing the needs of the customer against how much working capital you hold, because ideally you wouldn't hold any in a perfect world. You just react to it and deliver next day to the customer. But in the sort of tech, the complex environments we work in and international supply chains, we all understand that's not possible.
Mm. Perfect, thank you. And I guess I want to take maybe the next two questions maybe together really. So I guess it'd be interesting just to, again, just a very high level, get your views on how you see inventory optimization fitting into that wider picture of operations excellence. And I guess related question really is what happens when it's done well? What are the key benefits of getting this part of supply chain management right?
Yeah. So if I think of it in the wider context of operations, certainly let's look at it in terms of having too much inventory. You end up with a huge amount of footprint housing that inventory. I referenced at the beginning modular construction. I mean, that's a big product. So just think about that when you've got too much inventory there. You've actually got too much inventory, which are buildings which basically they're full of fresh air. So they're one of the worst things in the world to actually physically stock. So, you can't let it get out of hand in that context because you don't have the space for it. And then it starts costing you money because you have to rent warehouse space. So that, and you've got to count it. You've got to look after it. All these things, people working physically in the stores do a very vital function, but you'd kind of want to have less of them because it's not value add from a customer standpoint. So it's inefficient to have too much inventory from an operational sense. before you get into the working capital and the money side of things. If you haven't got enough inventory, and I come back to the balance side of it again, we all strive for lean operations and efficient operations. A lot of that goes out the window when you haven't got the parts available. If you're thinking of an assembly line, you might have 1,000 items in the bill of materials, and some of the things I've been involved with in the past have been very, very complex. It doesn't really matter whether you've got 999 items available or 950. You still can't assemble the thing, so it ends up, and certainly earlier in my career, when you see unavailability through to poor inventory holding, the amount of chasing around and what I would call inefficient operations and money spent to get parts there and time sometimes gets swept under the carpet. So it comes back to good balance. It'll never be perfect, but driving it down too much affects just what I'm talking about there. Having too much, obviously, comes at a cost premium, not just in working capital.
Perfect. And I guess the reverse of these is actually the benefits that you can see. So it's making sure that customer service is right, production lines are run, costs are minimized.
Exactly. I mean, the customer, you know, being spending majority of my career in procurement, you understand what the customer wants, because when people are saying to me, we can't deliver it, we haven't got this, you don't really care. You just want it.
Mm.
And people say, that there'll be all sorts of excuses, but the bottom line is, we're buying from you from a reason, because you're the expert in this field, and we expect you to manage it. And so um, I think my experiences give me a good perspective of what the customer thinks, because I'm the customer to a lot of people, and that gives me a good insight into what the customers, for the company that I'm working for.
Cool. And I guess it's that CPO perspective that I'm now fascinated to hear some of your insights on some of the challenges around inventory and inventory management and inventory optimization. So I guess one of the things that I would observe is that as soon as we enter a situation where inventory is a topic, you quite often see these different tensions within an organization related to the different perspectives that different roles and functions have. And I guess one at the heart of it is the tensions between potentially tensions between the CFO and the COO. So I guess from your CPO background, I guess it'd be good maybe just to talk to a little bit your experiences of what you can see those tensions are and why you think they exist.
Um, that's a very good question, and it comes down to the individuals in the position. So the answer is very generic. Um, a good CFO will understand the balance of providing good inventory and providing for customers. Shall we say a less experienced, less mature, or maybe, I don't know what the word is, less effective CFO will just drive for the lowest level. And I've seen that quite a lot. And the cynic in me will say that's really because the CFO is not measured on customer satisfaction. The CEO is a bit more balanced. He will have a working capital objective. He will have a customer service objective, as will a CEO. But a CFO sitting in finance will be a lot more to the side of lower inventory. Um, it's very interesting because the way you measure people and the way you incentivize people is very powerful,
Mm.
especially the incentivization piece. If somebody is going to incentivize you to drive to a certain metric, that needs balance in it. And I have seen CFOs in the past that will, whether it's procurement price savings, let's call it procurement savings, PPV, whatever you want to call it, and working capital. And if you drive too much to one, that does create a tension in the business.
Mm. And I guess one of the other experiences that I have is, and I think it's related to these tensions, is an issue of, let's say, for example, obsolete or slow moving stock. The question gets raised legitimately by the CFO. And the answer is who owns it? Who's
Yeah.
responsible? Who's accountable? So I guess again, maybe again with your perspective of from a CPO perspective, what do you observe when you see the kind of accountability question coming into play as well? In your view, for example, who is accountable for, let's say, slow moving stock?
So when I've seen it managed well is when everyone owns inventory. So everybody's got working capital objectives. Because we talked about the CFO, we talked about the COO. If you talk about somebody from a sales perspective, um, naturally they edge more towards having the right inventory to satisfy the customer because they're closest to the customer. Um, I can still hear somebody's words on a meeting a few years ago, a sales guy saying he loved inventory. He loved inventory because he could sell it. Yeah. Yeah. But then, where's the sales people or where is the person? Because there's a reason why things go into slow moving and obsolescence. People don't just put it in to inventory for the fun of it. There was a need to do it, whether it was lead time, whether it was batching economies, or whether it's for a customer. And tracking that back to the causality of why you did it is very difficult. We're working with clients at the moment, and there's a big lump of slow moving and obsolescence. Some of it you can see in the current forecasting. They're forecasting strangers, and that's always very, very dangerous. But there's other lumps in there that people are just saying, well, I don't know why it's there, to be honest. And that's where I think it breaks down. But to close on that question, Paul, I think making the different functional groups within the business own inventory in some shape or form in their objectives or their incentivization is the key to getting to better balance.
Well, that's great. That leads on to, I guess, my follow-on question, which is, we recognise that these tensions often exist. I think you've already started to indicate some of the solutions to that, but I guess what other steps do you think should be taken within organisations, or maybe steps that you have taken yourself to help get that better ownership, get better at that kind of driving the right kind of behaviour around inventory management?
Yeah, I mean, sales and operations planning, SIOP, which sales inventory operations planning, I guess, is, people call it different things, but dragging that multi-functional input into, what you're going to actually make, what you're going to buy is vitally important. And we talked about CFOs. The better CFOs are the ones that have the better balance. I think the better sales guys are the ones that understand the complexity of how difficult these things are to deliver, how many different part numbers need to come together to give full availability, to be able to assemble the product and send it out into the field and give them a happy customer. The guys that really understand that and know they need to interface back into operations to do it, to me, are the most effective sales guys. It's not just about booking orders. It's about flowing the information through to the customer, into the nerve center of the business and doing something with it. And it'll never be perfect. Um, people, in my experience, sales and operations planning is a difficult process. And as I say, it's never perfect. But where it's not bought into, you will end up with slow moving and obsolescence because operations are guessing sometimes.
Yeah. And I guess just reflecting on some of the things you say, one of the things that it touches upon, I guess, is this whole idea of true P&L accountability and responsibility. Who has that within the organization? Is it shared? How's it shared? And S&OP can obviously play a key part of that when it's got that kind of P&L focus and not just a pure planning focus, for example. So I think you've touched upon one of the processes you've already highlighted, which is around S&OP or S&IOP. Are there any other organizational implications that you'd like to highlight? So, particular roles or processes that you think it's essential for an organization to have in place?
I mean, important when you think of developing new products. So certainly in modular construction, the last business I was in, it's a very basic product, so it doesn't apply so much there. But where we would put a lot of focus, certainly in the security business that I work for, supplying high-tech equipment into airports, we would spend a lot of time configuring the supply chain,
Mm,
configuring the value chain, because the decisions you make at the beginning have a huge impact on what you will hold in inventory at the end. If you're choosing suppliers that are too far away and procurement are off negotiating a deal on X works, then you're going to end up with a lot of inventory that's sitting on a boat somewhere, and that will drive into your working capital. So getting everybody involved in the NPI process and configuring the value chain at that point is vitally important, because people go, oh, that's years away, that's not going to affect me now, but it's tomorrow's problem if you don't do it right.
no, exactly. Thank you for that, Ivan. And I guess this really then, for me, segues into a topic that's really close to my heart, which is so much of the discussion on inventory and inventory optimization focuses on the organization rather than the end-to-end supply chain. And I think that's where there's a bigger debate that we should be having as industry around suppliers and supplier management and how that plays into the whole inventory optimization piece. So I wonder if you could maybe just share some of your thoughts on insights on that whole topic of how this topic plays out in the world of supplier management and supplier relationship management.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the level of supply that you've got. I always, it's interesting. I mean, Kearney do a great, um, they call it the procurement chessboard, which
Mm.
I've always thought is great. It builds from a basic four box, a Kraujic four box, into um, 16 methods, 64 levers, I think it is. And apologies,
Yeah.
I might have got that back to
No,
front.
no,
But
that's spot on. I've used it myself. Yeah, yeah.
I've always thought it's great. I've been using it for years. And, if you think of it at its most simple, it's those key suppliers, the bottleneck suppliers that you really need to engage, and the partner suppliers as well. What I find is suppliers love to be engaged, especially in those areas. Just throwing tenders out at people. Yes, you have to do it in some of the more basic items, but really engage them and telling them what you want is vitally important. Um, the other aspect, the way procurement gets measured, can be a problem. So
Mm,
having been in both PLC and private equity, if procurement is too much focused on the cost angle, bill of material cost, then that can bounce up in working capital and other issues there. So having what I would call um, balanced measures on procurement that does include working capital is vitally important, so that the guys doing the deals with vendors are um, doing the right deals for the company. Yeah, because if you incentivize those guys in the wrong area, that's where stuff can end up going into obsolescence, because they're focused on the piece price, which isn't the true cost. So
mm,
there's different ways of doing it, which can be, how much working capital is sitting in that P&L, and give them an objective there. Another effective way is whatever you're writing off each year through slow moving and obsolescence, add that into what they're actually buying. Because
mm,
if you're driving a BOM cost reduction of 3%, but you're writing off the equivalent of another 1% each year in slow moving and obsolescence, the value being 1% of the spend, they've only achieved 2%. That's what it would be from a total cost perspective.
mm.
So, well, not a total cost perspective, but a more balanced view, and not just a ticket price. So I think that's important. The other thing is key, talk about engaging suppliers. The way you measure the supplier is very important as well. So, telling the supplier what is needed and the lead time that's required for the product, etc., is vital. Um, I come back to the customer perspective. I've had numerous, you know, meetings with suppliers where you get into supplier delivery performance, you've got issues with that supplier, and you get into your promise, my promise sort of thing, and
Mm,
complete waste of time. I try and cut that off at the neck straight away and just say, look, it. My customer does not care about your lead time. My
mm,
customer is not interested in that. So, with full respect, neither am I. You can't just move your lead times out, because that affects the end customer. That affects our ability to sell. And if our ability to sell reduces, then I'm going to buy less from you because I'm going to want less, because I'm going to
mm,
sell less. It's very, very simple. And sometimes you have to break it into those terms to cut that, not excuse, but cut that culture of my promise, your promise out in supplier reviews.
mm,
But the big thing is to engage them, and price is important. And different industries are um, in different places on that, but bringing in that more balanced objective, and getting the purchasing teams more towards total cost is vital.
mm. I just want to explore another angle to this topic as well. It was just as you were talking, it made me think of another aspect of the challenge, which is, I guess, the question of the focus of inventory within an organization versus the focus of, I guess, the orchestrator of the supply chain. So typically, the prime orchestrator is one of the players in the end-to-end supply chain. Could be the retailer, could be the distributor, could be the manufacturer, could be a number of different places. But typically, there's one person who effectively ends up being the orchestrator for a number of different suppliers. This is a long question, so forgive me. Is how that plays out in terms of their role in understanding the end-to-end inventory situation. So they may understand the inventory within their own organization, but whether or not they should have a better awareness of what the inventory is across the whole of the supply chain,
Yeah,
within brackets, an indication that provides either risk or opportunity.
yeah. So that, if I look at that in the context of a manufacturer, so if you're buying a product, you know, if I look at my modular construction experience, for example, people would talk about, they wanted to um, understand the supply chain all the way through, to the end supplier. And you've got a modular construction unit that might have a air conditioning unit in it, and that's tier one to the company that I work for. Within that unit, you'll have a control box in there that will have another assembly in there that will have some component. Before you know it, you're down at tier five and tier six, and this is where it gets really, really difficult to control. So I'm giving you an example there in probably the simplest business that I've worked from a product term, but from a product standpoint. But even in that business, you could really, if you
Mm,
really looked at it, you go right down into supply. Your ability to influence, you can influence tier two.
mhm,
Tier one, they're your suppliers, you can influence them. Tier two, typically you can influence. You get down to tier three, people are like, sorry, who are you?
mm, mm,
So it gets more difficult the further away you are. But clearly, when I look at electronic components and I go back to COVID, and I was working in that industry at the time, the pain we went through getting products available for airports, the money we spent just to fly things around, and
mm,
expediting charges and breaking down production. And sometimes that was down at tier four. So that's a very extreme example, because COVID caused ripples
mm,
through the electronic supply chain that had never been seen before. But that's the type of issues you can get, and coordinating that. You hear me say it again. It's never perfect, but the key thing there is to look past your own supplier. You know,
mm,
look at your because a lot of the time your supplier will just be assembling bits and pieces. If it's a machine part, it's pretty simple. If it's a bulk build going into one of your assemblies, that's where you tend to get the problems, and you've got to look further down the supply chain. And to pick your point, or to pick up on your comment of orchestrating it, being aware of those issues there. not
Mm.
just from availability, but also looking at it from the cost standpoint as well. Because, understanding, commodity markets and how they can flip up, and, tracking that as well is important, not just availability of the parts, because some of those can come back and bite you. And before you know it, your pricing has gone through the roof because nickel has gone up, or molybdenum has gone up, or a few others that have sort of bitten me in the past, as you can probably tell. So,
Yeah, I can. And I guess that's why, certainly within Iter, we also link this topic of inventory optimization, not just within the organization, but in the wider supply chain. Why we link it to that topic of resilience, supply chain resilience, because one of the factors, and certainly not the only factor, but one of the factors that helps make a supply chain resilient is also understanding how inventory is optimized, not just within the organization, but across the supply chain as well.
yes.
I want to pick your brains on another topic as well, and I guess this, I'm going to be really honest. This is a bugbear of mine, so I'm really interested in your views. So this is going to be a very hypothetical but very provocative question. You'll see where I'm coming from straight away. So I have often seen a situation where within an organization, the approach to try and reduce some of the inventory, some of the working capital, has been to adopt some kind of vendor management inventory program, VMI. Actually, what that's been about has been moving the responsibility for the inventory from one organization to another with some costs associated with it. It hasn't been about optimizing the inventory. And therefore, in the end-to-end supply chain, there's still the same amount of inventory, but just somebody else has taken the risk and somebody else has taken the cost. Feels like a win for the organization, but the supply chain is no more optimized than it was before. That's my very leading question. I'd be interested in your views on how that's played out in some of the experiences you've had, whether you see actually benefits with VMI and other similar kind of approaches to managing inventory in different ways.
Uh, It's a good. It works well on what I would call lower cost items, because you don't. When I think of VMI, when you're looking at low value items that you don't particularly buy often, or when you Pareto it, and these C class items are 5% of your spend, and the nine box that
Mm,
we've utilized in the past, you don't want to be buying those items very often. You just want to buy them and forget about them and do them in the cheapest possible way. And I think VMI works pretty well in that,
mm,
that field. When you get into what I would call the bigger items, and certainly I'm going back a long time now, there was a whole trend to um, commit business to people for a long period of time. And by doing that, you know, the concept of the buyback agreement came in, which
yes.
essentially you would dump all your old inventory on your vendor, get it off your books, and yeah, great. It's, your CFO is very happy. You've got that inventory off the books, you've made your targets for a number of years, but then that inventory is sitting there. It was typically slow moving and obsolescence, a big chunk of it
Mm,
at the beginning. Most vendors will be pretty commercially savvy, so it comes back into you in a slower rate, which you then get the dissatisfaction again because it comes back in these old boxes that you remembered sending them out in, and it slowly comes back in. Or if they weren't commercially savvy, then you've got a dissatisfied vendor that is saying, "When are you going to take this?" And
mm,
you know, pushing back on it. But you're stuck with them for a long time. So relationship wise, it becomes very, very difficult. And
mm,
that comes down to your question, I think. If you've done nothing to optimize the inventory, all you've done is moved it down the
mm.
supply chain tier, and
Yeah,
somebody else has got it and is invariably dissatisfied with it. So
yeah,
you're far better off, having a good process of writing off the bad stuff and providing for it each year. And you know it gets less painful because if you're writing stuff off, your CFO's not very happy, and that comes down to getting better decisions in the business more joined up so that you don't repeat that mistake in later years. Your slow moving and obsolescence that you write down each year as you go on the journey should be less and less each year as you improve.
Indeed. Thank you, Aaron. So I guess what I'd like to maybe start to conclude with is, and again, just related it again to your specialist area around supplier management and procurement. I'm sure we touched upon some of these things, but maybe you could just summarize 3 steps, 3 best practices, could be 2, could be 5, obviously, Ivan, about how you would go about kind of typically addressing inventory in relation to suppliers and supplier management and procurement.
So we touched on most of these anyway, but just to summarize, if you think of it at the beginning, engage suppliers in NPI, put the effort into NPI, new product introduction, because as I said earlier, if you don't do that and don't do that properly, then becomes your problem of tomorrow. So that's a key one, getting the vendors involved and fully understood at that point. The way you measure both a supplier and the procurement team is vitally important. If you go too far on cost, and certainly, what I've seen in the past is where businesses buy other businesses and they want to try and make a great business case at the pre-acquisition stage. You'll always get the question of putting 2 businesses together, how much more efficiently can we run that? If you push too hard on the cost side, certainly at that stage, it comes back to bite you. And it's not just at the M&A stage, but generally how you measure a supplier performance and a procurement team. If it's all about cost and it isn't balanced with working capital, then you'll see your warehouse bulge and your slow moving and obsolescence go up if you're not careful. So, and I think the key thing is it's not a perfect metric on there. These are high level metrics, but adding in what you're writing off on slow moving obsolescence, or just another, value of inventory metric and weighting that equally to the cost helps that. It helps from a supplier perspective and it'll help with your buyers as well. There was one more, wasn't it? My mind's gone blank now. I think I've linked 2 in together there because I think I linked the buyer and the supplier metrics in there together. So, I mean, just generally, somebody told me very early in my career, somebody that was very, was a CEO at quite a young age in his late 30s, outstanding person, and one I look back of and think, yeah, he was one of the smartest individuals I ever had the pleasure of working with. He was the one that always said this is all about balance, and he got it at a pretty young age, and just careful how you measure it. When people measure working capital to peer groups, but I remember working in a business where we were measured to peer groups in industrial businesses. What does that mean? That's not bringing in the customer aspect, because one industrial business might have lead times of 6 months, whereas another one is expected to deliver next day. So coming back to that holy trinity of what your customer is demanding is pretty important. So I think measuring against peer groups, benchmarking, etc., is fine, but it's got to be at a much more lower level. Don't do it at a high level because you're just comparing yourselves to people that the customer side of it isn't relevant, and that's important.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the insights. Just
No
a
problem.
reminder, this is a part of a series of interviews and discussions that we're having, and also a couple of events that we're also involved in. There's one coming up very shortly towards the end of April with the Best Practice Club, so I urge you to look up and see if you can get yourself registered onto that one. But we're also doing a series of articles and blogs and guides on this whole topic as well. So Ivan, thank you once again for your time.
Yes, Paul, thank you.